Hello. Hi.
Hi, everybody. I guess we're going to get started. We're going to introduce ourselves a little bit.
So we are Nathalie and Eric. We are an architect and a game designer. And we're going to talk about some of the projects we've done together, but just for a very short moment, tell you more about what we do independently when we're not working together.
Right. We want to thank Anna Kaisa and the whole Games Now team for bringing us out here. We're really happy to be here. I know there's lots of different kinds of talks today. There are some more about the industry, some more research talks. Our talk is a little bit more of like a designer's talk. We're going to be sharing work that we did together and also talk about some of the ideas and sort of how that work changed over time.
And somehow here and there we'll keep focusing on what are the material that we're using for our work. Not because that is the core of our work, but just because that has been changing the way that we think about our work over a period of time. So we're going to talk about things that we have liked and learned and that we're very happy to do, and then finally things that we disliked about what we've done. And, you know, be careful what you want to because you get it, and then you don't want it anymore. There's other project that we've worked on that we're going to present, but for a moment, this is Eric, the game designer.
So some of the stuff that I've worked on as a game designer that's not with Nathalie. I've worked in the game industry for many years. One of my early projects was Sissy Fight, a game about little girls in a social conflict on a playground. I co-founded a studio with Peter Lee in New York City, Gamelab, in the early 2000s, and we ran that company for about 10 years, making mostly online games and browser-based games. I also make tabletop games. I have worked a little bit in the educational sector. The Institute of Play is an organization I helped found that looks at games and learning and has designed whole schools where the curriculum is based on games and play as a model for learning. As an academic, I teach at the NYU Game Center in New York City, now full-time, where we have a bachelor's program and a master's program. And I've written books about game design, including Rules of Play with Katie Salen. Recent project was Dear Reader with Local Number 12, Colleen Macklin, John Sharp, Peter Berry. And this is a game published by Apple that uses public domain literature as the basis for word puzzle games. More recently, this is a book that I wrote, The Rules We Break, which is all of the ways I teach game design. Now let's go to Nathalie.
So, as an architect, I actually started with some work here in Finland. My first job was, you got to click, thank you. My clicking tool. Was with a group of Finnish architects that I met at Venice Biennale. Their name was Casagrande Rintala, and they were known for their physical installation that had, in some way, a participatory and narrative component. In this case, was a project I worked on for them at the Yokohama Triennale of Art. It was a nest upside down. Every day a bird would be sent with a meteorological balloon, carrying seeds. I think what I want to point out is that there was a connection between storytelling and physical space, and a bridge between architecture and art, perhaps. As an architect, I work often with artists when they need consulting or project management for large-scale work. This is from the Japanese artist Mariko Mori. It was set up in Brazil. Just to give you a sense of the scale, the whole work gets transported in 9 shipping containers, and it takes a month and 50 people to be set up, starting from electrician to engineer to carpenter, painter, you name it. I do like designing objects, and again, material. This carpet with felt using irregular shape. I usually like things to be right, and so messing things up was a change. And when in Finland, I also studied the wood program at the Aalto University, and definitely I'm from the Alps on the Italian side of Mont Blanc. Wood, my grandfather was a carpenter. Wood is part of how I feel, and I carry that idea of craftsmanship and working with carpenter in the project I'm working on. So here are just some example of interior design and custom table. I do work also more traditionally as an architect, meaning at the job site and construction. This is a tiny home. It's just 5.5 meters by 5.5 meters. And I think I just want to show this to say that the work as an architect is always a collaborative project, because somebody else is implementing what is more comprehensive process that you're seeing. And of course, it has a lot to do with material. There's material in the demolition, there's material in the construction. It's messy, the quantity are large, and I think more so than other industry, it's right in your face that what you consume and how much you consume. It needs to be carried. It has a weight, it's physical, it has an impact. So this is it. With
right.
These two backgrounds.
Right.
We are partner, and that's why we started working together. No other reason.
So what we want to talk about today are the projects that we did working together. So the projects that are sort of part architecture and part game design, and how our thinking changed. Now in games, there's a traditional idea, right? That games are separate from ordinary life. A very traditional idea that that there's the game and then there's life, and that's why, for example, if you can't bet on sports if you're an athlete, because we really need to keep that clear separation. But of course, we, like a lot of artists and designers, want to play with that idea, sort of blurring the boundaries, right? So you'll see that in some of the projects, we do things like having players interfere in each other's games or bring real money into a place that normally would be just a play space separate from ordinary life. But I guess we're kind of setting up the trajectory that we're going to talk about. In some way, even though we thought we were playing with these and blurring these boundaries between real life and the games, we also were in some way also still escaping, right? Still building a sort of a fictional space, a fable-like narrative, and definitely for each project, physically building a whole new project from scratch. So going from, and the trajectory that we want to talk about is going from projects like this, which are about building these objects for galleries, to something quite different.
To something completely different, like this one, where this is one of our projects where we didn't build anything new, and it wasn't even really a game. I think it's the project that we are most satisfied and happy. It goes against everything we thought we wanted to do. It was a change in what we felt for our own ego, what it means to be, I'm doing the best, I'm doing the most. And in part it's because after doing a series of projects, we realized what is the economy behind the resources that we're using, the budget we're given, how that budget is being used, what is the long-term use of that budget, is that really the best way to use the resources that we're given? So,
to put it another way, we didn't want to make the title of our talk too negative, but this is another way of thinking about what we're doing, why we stopped building games. But let's back up a little bit and show you some of the earlier projects that we did. So we're going to quickly go through some of these earlier ones. One was Flatlands. So this is a project that's based on an archive of more than 100 game boards from board games. And it's a project that creates an archive where each of these shelves holds a board that you can pull out. So one of the motivations for this project, really to be honest, was that I had over the years collected old board games, and eventually I had so many I had to get rid of the boxes, so they were just the boards and you couldn't play them. And sometimes I would decorate an office where I was working with them, but I had so many more and we didn't know where to store them. So we ended up making a game installation around them. And we talked about this idea. So one of the themes is about creating these fictional spaces, right? So there's a way in which Flatlands is both a fictional and a real archive of game boards. The way that it works is that it's a game for 3 or more players. That there's a director who serves as kind of a judge, and they are drawing these cards, and the cards make a procedural sort of mission for the 2 players, or criteria for the 2 players to go searching through the archive. So here it's colonial power. This was at the Museum of Decorative Arts in Paris. So there's French translations, but you could see that the next card might be colonial poets. So the language is taken from a military speech from a totalitarian regime. So it also has a connection to the real world in that sense. Part of the play of the game is then going through the archives and looking for the board that matches the criteria, and the judge picks it. So it's a very simple game. But I think one of the interesting things to us is that the archive is a real archive. It's an actual collection of old board games, but then it's recast in the game as a sort of a fictional archive in this narrativized bureaucracy in which you're playing this role of an archivist and a judge.
And going to search through the board as part of the board in general. They're beautiful. They are on my way.
Sorry. I'm also trying not to stand in front of the beautiful board.
The boards are beautiful. They are colorful. They are cheerful. They range in a large span of time. But looking at the board, I think you can quite quickly to realize that are just not as naive as they look. I'll give you an example. This is a female version of a career game where it's ballerina, nurse, and one looks like a holy saint.
That's the actress career for the female careers here.
It really reflects a lot of the time that they were built. And the materiality itself of the board is also beautiful, and the fact that they are old and they represent a different time and different value, it comes through the physical damage which is in the board. Now, the funny thing is that because now this has been acquired by the Centre National des Arts Plastiques, the collecting French entity that collect physical design project, they're now being handled with gloves. And at the same time, it's a project that when it's being installed, it's made to be touched by the public. So, as Eric mentioned, it's both a real archive and a fictional archive, and those two realities somehow overlap. But something else, again, that maybe we're shifting away from what is the idea of the game is how the game was fabricated. This was one of the multiple installations. It had been installed in New York, in Atlanta. In New York, it was made with black cardboard boxes that got trashed at the end. In the second installation in Atlanta, we built it in plywood. And we're not able to ship the plywood for the cost of the volume that it had. So the plywood was discarded. We don't remember what happened.
We donated it to an artist supplies organization, but it was built, and then donated.
So in the third and last installation, again, we rebuilt the boxes in Paris that will become part of the collection and definitely being stored and collected. On the other hand, there's a huge amount of material that went through this process of building, destroying, rebuilding, destroying. And even just thinking what was our awareness at the time, plywood has formaldehyde. There's versions of plywood that are soy-based glue and have far less impact in the production and the use, and in general, sustaining a different system. Now, this is just to say that in retrospective, as much as we love the game, there is constant rethinking of why do we want it to build big? Why do we want its size and volume to be impressive? It's sort of satisfying your own ego and what you're taught, even as a student, about what is relevant and what is important, in part. So, in the same way, those mixed feeling comes with other projects. Starry Heavens is a project that we have installed in the garden at MoMA and a few other locations. And on the diagram of the left, and you see the setup as it was in the MoMA garden. It was with large inflatable helium balloon. On the right is in Den Bosch in the Netherlands. And the game really happens for an event with a very large crowd for a short amount of time. So it's a game that is designed really to absorb 100 people coming and leaving the game endlessly because there's no turns. And the canopy, which is on top of the game, has no purpose in the game. Technically, it's useless. On the other hand, and here you see that we got bigger and bigger. This is in Washington, D.C., where it reached the scale almost of our urban scale. Is 3-story tall. To be inflated and tested, they did it in a gym in the Netherlands, and it was getting off from the door of the gym because it was so large. I guess what I was saying, and I'm losing my track, is it doesn't have a specific purpose, except that this game being played in a very large crowd, it needs a placemaking, an element that would define, hey, here, underneath here, something is happening, right, rather than being lost in the large number of people where you may only see back and crowd.
Right.
So it doesn't have a role, but it does have a role.
Right. And then that idea of what is our relationship to the context in which we're working, and to what extent we are sort of imposing or creating something within this space, this museum context where we're working. In terms of how the game works, underneath the inflatable element, there's a network of connected metal discs on the ground, and there's a ruler player that stands in the middle, and the ruler is telling everyone what color to step on, black, white, or gray, and the players kind of move around trying to get to the middle and kick each other out and overthrow the ruler. It becomes a sort of stylized dance as players move around the space, and this is from, there you can see the pieces on the ground. So it becomes kind of a stylized interaction as players move around the grid. They have to collaborate with each other to sort of knock each other out, and they're constantly being exited from the game, but then they can re-enter at any time and start playing again.
Basically, if two people touch one, that person is out.
Right.
And that's...
Right.
While you're trying to reach the center and be the ruler.
And the ruler, meanwhile, is saying they're saying black, white, or gray. Okay, I think the ruler was actually replaced here, and people are applauding that. So the ruler is sort of this impotent and absurd authority figure in the game that is constantly, okay, bow to the new ruler. That was one of the rituals of the game when there's a new ruler coming in as well. And so it's sort of pointless to be a ruler, and the game is sort of a political fable in that sense. It's very theatrical, and as you can see from the video, we've had versions where there was a live musicians performing that turned it into a kind of theatrical performance. And even though it's sort of a political commentary on the world, on power, on what it means to be subject to an authority that you're also trying to overthrow, it definitely operates by building a space that's separate from the real world.
Can I say something we haven't talked about? In one of the second iteration, music was added, and when the ruler becomes the ruler, they decide who are the ruler. Somebody said, I'm the ruler of the chicken. And the musician started playing a very goofy music. That meant if people wanted, they started moving like chicken-like. But then in Berlin, night, hot summer, a girl with no brush, I am the queen of sex. And then all of the moves were suddenly, sexist and full of shows and nice. So there was definitely an agency for the player within the game for that moment of...
as a ruler, you get to define the vibe of your reign, which sometimes can be very, very short.
Yeah, very much so. And again, thinking about material, no function, but we got bigger and bigger, and still somehow trying to make things better. Because after the 2 installation with the helium balloon, we realized, helium, it's a finite resource. It's needed for medical reason and cannot be replenished. So in this last installation, instead of using helium, we went big, but it was a cold air inflated object, meaning that there were fans blowing cold air to keep the shape of the work. And all of this and the month, it was up for one afternoon, which is getting to what was the point. Is it really a good way for the system, for us, to use the resources that were given? And if you think at the time we had so much adrenaline and energy to engage into designing, fabricating, coordinating, shipping, voltage from Europe to US, it's infinite, and it's for an afternoon. So we're getting to the last of our build project.
Right. Interference.
Interference, which was a project in which, thinking about shipping, we started considering things need to be light, right? No more heavy pieces. And in interference, the game board are in fact 5 vertical thin wall. They are 1.5 millimeters thin. They're etched, different panels that are connected to each other. They're lace-like, and you see that they look a little bit an organic shape. This was commissioned by la Gaieté Lyrique, a cultural center in Paris, very ornate architecture. Somehow it inspired the project. But the 5 walls are almost like an organic beehive, or as if you had sliced an organ, and each different wall, this organ grows and shrink, and it's different in size. So there's it's metallic, but it's also very human-like in some way.
So the game itself is a simple game where players are putting these little wooden pieces in and out of the wall, and 2 people play in a very local area, but a move in the game means reaching over to where other people are playing and taking a piece from their game and putting it in your game. And you can see that people are doing that. They're walking around because they're required to go and mess up the games of other people. And then you end up sometimes negotiating with them. Okay, let me, please no, take this one, not that one. She's laughing because she just stole a piece from someone else and messed up their game. So it's called interference, and it's about interfering with other people's games. So again, we're playing with the conventions of like what's proper play and what's right play, but we're also doing so in a very protected space, right? This is in the sort of very designed, beautiful museum, and it's very, very separate from ordinary life in the end. So I guess the question is really how much were we really actually messing with systems and playing and questioning things? The process of design in this case involved not just the prototyping and play testing of the gameplay, but also the physical materials. Here we're testing the scale. So this was like a mock-up of the height of the walls that was 3 meters tall, and how tall did you need to be interacting with the walls, and testing things like figuring out how we're going to play test. This was again another mock-up that we did, a play test where we could have a few walls on tables, thinking about the translucency of the materials. So the material engagement really intersected with the gameplay evolution as well.
And even just for the pawn, there's so many elements. They had to be a certain size so that by French code could not be swallowed by a child. On the other hand, the paint had to be such that a child could swallow it. There's a groove to make sure that the pawn is easily stable, but not so much that you shake it. What's the wood that we're using for the pawn? It was poplar, being light enough, but durable enough so that it wouldn't bend the super thin wall.
Right.
So a whole series of tiny details
we had all
that
the
went
restrictions of like toy regulations, but we also everything for installation regulations of fire codes and safety and things like that too.
With for wheelchair access, for example, so the height of the gameplay was considered accessible to people of different height access. And I think I love this. Right? This is all real and concrete. It's beautiful. I find it makes me smile even just looking at the picture in a way. And yet, we decided to stop. This is not the best use of our resources, time, and in general, the way we're working. So we looked at now to 3 of several games that we've done. And what we want to show you are other projects that we started working on. What does it mean to do a project that's not really trying to escape from the context or situation where we're at, and what it means to work with existing spaces. I'm a little compulsive, so usually I would straight things up. I don't like, I like order, I like control. What does it mean to give that up and accept that you don't have absolute control on the aesthetic of the result, on the exact outcome, and maybe focus more on what's the process that goes to that outcome.
And that led to waiting rooms.
So waiting rooms is it's both very simple and very complex. And there were 2 inputs perhaps that led us to work on this project. One was that we were offered to use a whole building. It sounds fantastic.
Right.
And the other was that perhaps we wanted to resolve one element that always has been difficult.
Of players learning the game, right? So all of our other games, because we were thinking about a game that, again, even as we were trying to play with real life, they were sort of traditional games in that you had to learn the rules. So in Interference, there's a game that you're playing, there's rules, you're trying to win. What do you do on a turn? You're taking a piece from other people. But in the end, to play the game, someone has to learn the rules. You have to have it explained to you. You have to watch a video. You have to watch other people play and figure out the rules. So we were always making posters and postcards and handouts and videos, having attendants that were trained to teach people. But there was still this sort of traditional hurdle that you get over, right? Because unlike a video game that's more automated, an analog game, the players have to run the rules. In waiting rooms, we changed all of that. We found a way to make the rules very simple. You basically, you stand in line, and then the attendants will tell you sometimes to go here, go there, take a ticket, sit down.
We all have an experience with a waiting room. We don't know what that means because each room has different rule of, do you have an appointment? Are you the first one in line? Somebody's jumping the line. But in general, we all have a clear expectation of what may happen when you're waiting in a room. And really the only 2 things that you were told when entering was stand in line, follow the signage. And I would say also this is a project where if you were to break the rule, it was okay.
Right.
Things were actually better.
Right.
There's not you don't break the system by not following the rules.
Nope.
Oh.
So we used a lot of the spaces that were not the normal spaces for the game. Like, in other words, not the public spaces, galleries. We used those a little bit, but we also tried to focus on spaces that you would normally see, like the freight elevators and the staff lounges and utility corridors.
So intentionally, instead of using the exhibition spaces that already had a specific contact, the exhibition, we were using the building after hours and shifted the focus to what was the system behind the building, the corridor, the locker room, the cleaning supply area, storage. And we didn't design those rooms. It was the other way around. We used affordances given by those rooms. Are there chairs? Are they big? Are they a large empty auditorium, which is very formal, rather than a tiny room that's good for 2 people with plenty of boxes? So whatever was there was somehow influencing what we would design as a waiting room. whether it was messy or formal.
And the way it works is that each room has different rules that you would follow. The rooms in the building were connected by these taped lines on the floor, and you would, when you exited a room, you had to pay a fee in either tickets or pennies, and you didn't know exactly where the line would lead. So you were sort of like, okay, I guess I'll take this exit and follow the taped floor, which sometimes would lead you up staircases or into an elevator or something like that. And every room was like, had the attendants would come in and sort of tell you what to do. So for example, we're going to give you a couple examples. In this room, when you came in, everyone was standing in a line, and the attendant would look you over and say, please stand here in line. And then you would get in line. And then eventually the person in the front of the line would be allowed to leave, and then they could take somebody with them when they go. And I think they got a couple pennies or something like that as well. The other person got a couple pennies.
It might take you a moment to realize that you are aligned by height.
By height, right. So actually the attendant is looking at your sort of biological differences, but by height. And the shortest people were in the front of the line. So the people in the end were always the taller ones, and they started realizing, even though the line is moving forward, more people are coming into the room, they're never going to get to the front of the line. And so then very, very creative ways that they started having to negotiate with each other in order to be the one that was picked to leave.
So if you're tall, you have to decide how you're leaving, which is either begging the first person, please take me, offering them ticket or money,
right,
or do anything to get you out because you won't leave.
Right.
Can I say the...
I don't know how we are on time, but go ahead.
There was a test, because it's a very delicate system to make sure that the density of people works from room to room, where the donor of the museum participated. And they were very appropriate benefactor of the museum. In this line, they decide to do the right thing.
Just this one night. It wasn't
just that one night. So
yeah, only happened once, but
that the first will take the last. And we arrived, and there was this man in suit, sitting on the ground, clearly pissed, because he was in the middle. he was never tall enough to be the last, and never short enough to be the first. And he had been there 20 minutes.
Right. He was really upset.
He was very upset at the moment,
right.
But then at the end,
it turned out that he really enjoyed it, and he volunteered to be part of the project the next night. So.
And this is interesting because a lot of those dynamics you realize at the end of the game, you share, get feedback, you realize other experience,
right.
But also the person that were short, they said, I didn't realize there was any issue here at all.
Right. I came in, they put me at the front of the line,
and then
I left. So the privileged, the shorter privileged people. And anyway, but that's a really good example of how this project started playing, I think, with the real world, with real physical differences, with real spaces, without creating a fictional space, but in a different way. So we like the way that it started blurring these sort of lines in a new kind of way. There were multiple economies in the project. I mentioned there's tickets, and then there were also pennies. And the pennies were real pennies, so some people were instantly rich if you came in and you happen to have a lot of change.
Except that many thought that was cheating, that you couldn't use the penny you had,
right,
but there's no rule.
Right.
And it's you make your own decision.
Right.
Am I deciding I can use that or not?
And every room basically had different ways for you to either spend or gain these pennies and tickets. There was another currency, which was candy, that was an unofficial currency that you could use to bribe attendants. So sometimes there were bowls of candy in a room, and you could give them to an attendant or guard. These were the names of the people that were the part.
It was up to the attendant to let know if they like somebody. Hey, actually, if you give me a candy,
right.
It was in our control when that would
right. That
happen.
was a sort of a soft currency.
Yeah.
Waiting rooms was interesting for us because it also engaged with the creation of a fictional space like some of our other projects, but without a plot. There was no script that you followed. So the people that were working the performance, that were attendants and guards, they had a job description basically, but it didn't say this line or be this character. And there wasn't a sort of pre-scripted plot, but there was a narrative. There were all these kinds of narrative things that emerged through the interactions, like the guy that got pissed with the
as a job description, they were given information, for example, the way you address people, whether it's formal or informal.
Right.
They were given some guideline, again, as if it was a job description, but not clear indicate.
But not narrative.
You are you. You are not a character.
Right.
This is what are the rule, and if something happened, it's your interpretation of making it to your best of your judgment.
Right. And just to give you one more example of one of the rooms and waiting rooms, this was the sitting room, and when you came in here, people would. There were empty chairs, and the attendant would say to you, welcome to the room. You may have a seat if you like. Some people sat down in the chairs, some didn't. And then once every minute, the attendant would say, it's 8:32, and whoever was sitting in a chair would get a penny. And there were very few places where you could just sort of get income, right? You desperately wanted these pennies and tickets because sometimes it was very expensive to go on a particular line. This one cost 10 or 20 pennies, so how do I get all those pennies? So people started sitting in these chairs for a very long time, spending their time earning 1 penny a minute, sometimes 10, 15, 20 minutes. And then, there was no way to know who was going to get the chair next, and the attendant was told to let the guests figure out how to do that, and not organizing. So there were all kinds of systems that came up. People would sometimes write down lists. People would stand in a single file line. They would stand on a line in front of each chair. Often the people in the chairs started auctioning off their chairs. I will get up for whoever pays me the most tickets, right? You earn pennies here, but you give me tickets and I'll get up. Then people would really got sometimes quite heated about what was the correct system. Was this a democracy or not? One night,
so there was a line to stand in line with no rule for the top line, but a rule for the 1 penny a minute line.
One night, somebody sat on somebody else's lap and said, okay, we both get a penny because we're both sitting in the chair. The attendant looked at their job description and didn't cover it, so they gave them both a penny. And within 5 minutes, on these 5 chairs, they were sitting like 8 or 10 people deep. Strangers, just all sitting on each other's laps, and then the room ran out of pennies, and we're desperately trying to get the...
We couldn't manage the penny.
Yeah, so it was really interesting when Nathalie talks about the fact that in this case, really breaking and bending the rules and having this kind of creative player behavior was interesting. But I think it did so in part because we also were changing the relationship of the players to the rules. It wasn't a sort of formal game that you would learn, and also your relationship to who you were as a person and who you were to the space.
And we are as a person, I would say we put a lot of attention how we were naming things. So visitors, these are visitor. And we try to find a word that could be visitor of the real building, visitor of the museum, visitor of the project waiting room, visitor of the fictional bureaucracy. So you were never clearly a character or yourself. You could be any of this. And in part it's because I am not the person that jumps in and says, I want to play a game. And I was like, no, let me.
Right. And
I'll look. And this feels to me like a way to be as engaged or as yourself, as theatrical or as viewer as much as you want. You can really place in the context that you're more comfortable.
Right.
There was not a clear way to win the game, but everybody somehow gave themselves some goal. For somebody it was, I'm trying to see all of the room, although there was not a plan. You could find a plan in one of the rooms, so you didn't really know how many are the room, or you could try to go to the most expensive room.
Right.
The goal might have been to reach back or free your friend trapped in a room. Everybody had his own rule. And even in that sense, those rooms that were the highest priced were apparently there may be something exceptional happening. Nothing exceptional was happening. You will get a ribbon that is a ribbon. What does the ribbon mean? It's a ribbon that has the significance of a prize. It's pointless except for the value that you're being given yourself. It's in a way, it's a very simple experience for the viewer designing it. It's, in fact, very complex, and it's not easy at all to move it from space to space. it's like a plumbing system where, depending on the size of each room and the interaction for that particular room, you do need a certain density of people. You imagine in line by height doesn't work if there's two people. You need to make sure that at that room there's always a certain amount of people.
Right.
So it's like a plumbing system, which is about the flow, about the density, about the pressure, and that depends on the specific rule of the layout of that building. There's also a whole other layer, which is because we were pushing and going into spaces that are usually not accessible to the public, there's a layer of rules that are the waiting room rules, but there's a series of rules which are actual safety, where we would push the boundary where people could go, and actual guards are there. Let's say in the Boston Museum, there's a real zoo inside the museum. There's animal that cannot be disturbed and damaged, cannot be let free, or there's fire escape, or there's area where food is cooked. So there's a overlap between us with the curator, pushing as much as possible the limit of their own institution to let people go where usually people are not allowed for valid reason. And that is also that interesting overlap between the different realities. And as we were saying, we did not push an aesthetic. The building is what it is. The blue tape is there because it's installed in the evening very quickly. Had to be cheap. Although this is very complex because there's 100 of those signs that need to be at the correct place. So there's a behind the scene, quite complex bureaucracy to make this bureaucracy work. Even just the pencil for each attendant, there's about 25 of them, right? Each job description, the right tool, the right equipment, the right amount of penny and ticket for the room. It's a huge bureaucracy to set up the bureaucracy. But with that in mind, again, there's no plot. The quotes are great just because it's important that I could recognize who's the person that is the attendant. And also a quote was chosen in such a way that didn't look neither medical nor scientific. We intentionally look for a model that wouldn't signify anything.
I think we need to speed up a little bit.
Why did we start this project? Because I got a green card. And in the process of the green card, which is in an abandoned mall far away in Queens, underground, with abandoned little horses for kids, there were scenes that were so hilarious and comical, but there was nothing funny about them because at that time you were yelled, go there, sit there, and camera were forbidden. So that is one of the inspirations.
One of the inspirations. And of course we were looking at other cultural references too, like Tati's Playtime, which is a wonderful film. If you hadn't seen it, I think every game designer should watch this film. But it's about a bureaucracy where nothing happens. It's sort of like it's a film without a plot. It's a narrative without story, really. And it's also like Waiting Rooms. It's really about the sort of arbitrariness and value of these human systems within a bureaucratic system.
And then other fancy reference, I don't know, fashion, Tom Brown, who's redesigning men's suit, super expensive one, but then they are too short, the pants, right? Or with a twist, or what is normal and expected. I don't know, I think there's so many references of waiting rooms and what we know a waiting room to be, from funny, sarcastic, to much more serious. If I think of architecture design, this is the Supreme Court of the Netherlands. 10 minutes, but let's jump in one project. Yeah. Everything is black and white. Justice is right. Everything is aligned. There's a sense of communicating. We have things under control. At the very opposite spectrum, a group of an art project from Lucinda Devlin, a US photographer that documented a death penalty room in the US. So this is the Omega Suite series, where in this extremely large photograph, you realize how what is somehow communicated as a neat, clean, clinical process. It's in fact, none of that is about, it's it's dirty, it's messy, it's human, there's rust, there's dust. So there's a horror in the banality of the plastic chairs for such a terrible things to happen. So the opposite of the Supreme Court that we've seen before, both of them problematic somehow in different ways. So in waiting room, really thinking about the difference, the fundamental is that going from fun and dreamlike, we just embrace what is the messiness of the situation and what was available in the space. Here are some photos of the installation in Boston. As you see again, it's the back of the spaces, the tide that peels, things aren't so glamorous, but it's also what really makes things work and what makes the museum work.
And in some ways, waiting rooms goes against everything that we thought we had to design, right? Building beautiful rooms and objects, creating these elegant systems of rules that players would learn. And what we found was that it broke all of those rules, right? Even the idea that players had to obey the rules, right? It had the most interaction and the most kind of interesting, emergent experiences, even though it really, in terms of architecture and game design, it was really the most different. So we want to finish up by showing you one more project. And this project it's both our first project and our most recent project that we worked on together. So it was our first collaboration, but our most recent installation here in Finland. And it sort of represents the before and the after of the way that we approach design and materials. So this project is called 16 Tons, and the title comes from the Tennessee Ernie Ford folk song, "You load 16 tons, and what do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt." Okay, but it's about working in a mining town and getting more and more in debt because you are basically in indentured servitude in a company town where you have to pay a lot of money and go into debt just to go to work, and then you're really never going to pay off that debt. So there are 4 players, and they're moving these sections of heavy steel pipe. The twist to the game is that it's very easy to win. You just need to get the 2 pipes of your color next to each other on this simple grid. But the twist is that on your turn, you can't move your own piece. The other players, at the beginning of the game, everybody takes out $3 or euros. This was a high-stakes game with $5 bills. But you bid on other players' labor. So it's really a game about labor. And instead of you just knowing what you want to do, you have to do what you're paid to do by the other players, and the money kind of circulates over time. At the end of the game, the player who has moved their 2 pieces together probably had to spend all their money to bribe another player to move them into the winning position, but then they don't have any money left. And there's ambiguity about what you do at the end of the game. Does the winner get all the money? Do you keep the money you have, in which case the winner has no money? Or does the money go back to where it was at the beginning of the game? So there's that kind of interesting engagement with the real world, in this case with the materiality of actual real physical currency as well. And the materials were also important here.
Now, we wanted the pieces to be heavy, because it was about, $3, you move that there, like a little bit nasty. And between us, Eric was fighting for, let's make them accessible. They cannot be too heavy, heavier. Cannot be too heavy, heavier.
Right.
So this was, constant battle. And I think on the end, we kind of both came to different positions.
Right. I had been arguing that they should be more ergonomic, little kids would want to play. But in the end, I think if they were super heavy, it maybe would have been more interesting, where it would have had to take 2 people to really drag them. So it was actually even more uncomfortable in terms of the labor.
And on my end, rather than designing a piece that looks aesthetic as a little bit one of a sad kindergarten from a steel company, I mean, color aren't that bright, they could have been sacked with gravel, bags with gravel. There's not the need of having the workshop of the museum, getting the steel pieces and fabricating them, etc., etc. So there's things we liked about this game and things that we disliked. And
Right.
when we were asked to install a project for the exhibition in Quovola, 16 Ton is the game that came to our mind. And we knew we would have a budget, but rather than thinking refabricating or shipping elements from the US to Finland, or getting new wall build, using that budget for the material, we were trying to think how can we use the budget maybe more with labor and people rather than physical resources. So what we did was to, thanks to the collaboration with the curators, we put enormous amount of work. We tried a way to work with the process. In that case means that we work with 2 students from the school in Quovola that started researching material available in the school, in the local area. Jutta and Suvi did an enormous amount of work scavenging, measuring, documenting things that perhaps we could use, not knowing what they may be, not knowing where we would be ending up. These, by the way, they are a collage from Carolina Andrade that helped us to represent the process. So there were 2 things mainly that we needed. Some were heavy pieces, and they found that concrete bags were often broken and discarded and couldn't be sold. But for our purpose, which wasn't a highly structural construction, we could just get those bags for free that otherwise be trashed. A local factory was working with foam, which is already going to be upcycled for composite material, but they were willing to donate it temporarily and then take it back and reinsert it into their process. So this was another one of the material. A lot of steel element left from the metal workshop. So those are some of the material that we started gathering and then figuring out in quite a short amount of time how can that be used for the project that we're doing. So in the second phase, based on those material available, started looking into what could be the fabrication process, both for the spawns and the wall, and also the grid from the floor. They all changed compared to what was the original.
With the paper walls and
paper
steel
wall
pipes.
And steel pipe. None of that remained the same. I don't know, Eric, you want we use bucket. They use bucket to cast the concrete. The steel element were just again for height, so that they could be reached and left. The wall ended up being layered element of different sheets, very heavy. So finding a way to compact them meant that they had to be how do you say, Eric?
Sewn together.
Sewn together, yes.
In these steel casings.
The mesh is something that was purchased, but again, we're trying to use the least possible material to use and compact them.
And this was really, for us, this was a whole process where we were working with the students and working with the curators, and it was a totally new process for us because while we had projects that were shipped and then installed, they were sort of pre-made elements. This was the first time that we were not on site, so we never went there. We were collaborating with them on their research, design, and development process, but we were using all upcycled materials, and we enjoyed the process, but it was actually really challenging for us to not even be there, not see the space, not have our hands on the pieces.
And there's definitely much less control on what is the outcome, which is, okay, I am so interested. I don't know for a viewer what that's experienced, but I am very interested to let go of the exact aesthetic that the project will be, and rather have a much more complex understanding of what is the economy, the resources, who is there. It's to me simply the fact that the factory were willing and happy to help the student, right? Just all of the connection that happened with that. With the process that we worked on.
And so if in waiting rooms we had to let go a little bit of our aesthetic of making a beautiful object and instead put up these sort of cheap signage and rely on the space itself, this pushed that even more in the sense that we were even less involved in we had less control over the kind of aesthetics of the objects, and we had to sort of embrace this idea that it was going to be the result of a process of collaborating with these students, which for them was the very first time they were ever making a gallery installation. In terms of the gameplay and rules, the gameplay wasn't going to change, but there was still a lot to work out. For example, the space, we didn't have those circular walls, but instead we had these rectilinear walls. And the space is actually incredibly important for this piece, that it creates a kind of a protected area where you feel okay putting out money and paying and bribing other people. So the space has entrances, but we found through experimentation that the space design is really important, and we had to rethink it based on this rectilinear elements. And even the grid elements, if you remember, and all of those, the ones with the sort of the round paper walls, there also were round dots here and Arabic numerals, but because we didn't want to have to print that and cut them out and pay for printing on adhesive and just use like basically, straight.
It's much more efficient to use a tape.
Right. So these were basically from rolls of tape, and we used crosses instead of circles and Roman numerals instead of Arabic numerals, and it just a lot of details changed.
Yeah. So I think repeating a little bit, but I know we wanted to build beautiful things, and then now it doesn't matter so much. It's much more what is the process interest that we have, how the resources are being used, how those resources are affect us or affect who's working on the project, and perhaps things will merge, but it's been a shift that really went through trashing a lot of things over time, and reevaluating what we care in what we're doing.
And we really want to thank Mari at the museum,
so
and Jaakko who curated the whole project for like their willingness to work with us on this uncertain process. So I think we're finishing up now. So just to say a few final thoughts, I often say that game design is about systems literacy, right? And that playing is at its best when you're not just playing in a system that's made, but you're somehow playing with that system, maybe as a player or as a designer, and changing that system for the better. And that could be the game itself, the context where the game is made, maybe a social system or a cultural system that you're commenting on. So for me, these projects, working with an architect, kind of expanding my idea of what it means to be a designer, really changed my thinking and my relationship, I think, to my work. And I guess I just want to have us all think about how it is that we are defining what it is that a good game is in a university setting as a student, or in a commercial setting in the industry. What do we think of as a good game, right? Like what is that? How is that constituted? I think that this, just to finish with a project that I'm working on now, a new project, this is the Green Games Guide, which was a lot spurred through my interaction with Nathalie. I want to give her credit here. This is a group of climate scientists, manufacturers, publishers, and designers that I'm working with in the tabletop game world. This is just one page from this guide that we published on best practices for sustainably publishing card and board games for the tabletop industry. And in architecture and in fashion and in other design fields, of course, for many years there have been industry people getting together, trying to form best practices and agreements about how they're going to work sustainably, but there wasn't anything in tabletop games that was comparable.
Couldn't find anything.
We couldn't
in the
find
US.
anything,
Yes.
right? And I just want to say that thinking about games and impact, it's about environmental sustainability, but it's also, for example, in the US, thinking about working conditions and the culture of the companies where we're working. And it's also not just about physical games, right? Digital games also have an impact on the climate, and websites and server farms also have an impact on energy use and the climate as well. So that doesn't mean that we shouldn't stop doing what we love doing, which is designing games and making games and causing trouble and being creative and bringing people joy and play. But I really want to argue through this whole talk today about an expanded idea of what it means to be playing with those systems and for thinking about where are the boundaries of what we're doing as designers, and can we think in more expansive ways.
And there's just, this is the last. Some years ago, when this rethinking started, we came across an interview from Dieter Rams. Dieter Rams is perhaps the most well-known industrial designer. We're all impacted by his design just because of the aesthetic of the Apple product.
You're thinking of your iPhones, for example.
And in the 70s, he had presented a principle of design, including being durable, being unobstructed, honest, as little as possible, eco-friendly. Now it's the 70s, a long time ago. And so he is the most iconic industrial designer. And in the most recent interview, he was asked what would he do differently. And he just said, if I had something to do in this world again, I would not want to be a designer. I believe it would be less important to have many things and rather exercise care about where and how we live. So rather, he's thinking his role as a designer and more as a system manager and resource manager, which I find very touching, especially coming from such an iconic person. And again, what Eric was saying, what are we thinking is good change and shift? It definitely shifted for me.
Right. But I also want to say, I think for me, even expanding my idea of who my collaborator was and working with someone from outside my field,
this is a love declaration. Okay, good.
that was going to challenge me and my thinking too. So I think it's also who you work with and how you work with them as well.
Thank you
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much.
I want to start with a question, and the audience, if you want to ask questions, just raise your hand and then wait for the mic. There is a possibility for you to ask questions. I have a couple of mine. I'm going to start one. And it's that when you're working with like museums or different kinds of places that are not necessarily places of play as such by design, do you have to, like how much today you still have to kind of face the explaining of what play means and what kind of playful things you want to create? Is there any resistance or misunderstandings that your kind of partners in play might have?
I think that who's approaching us already has an idea and there's no misconception.
From the curator. Because often we're sort of ghettoized, like, oh, we're appearing in a museum because there's an exhibition on play or something like that.
Yeah.
So, but on the other hand, I think a lot of what happens with games that has to do with, for example, interacting directly with a piece, maybe being noisy or disruptive in the museum, because sometimes play can be explosive or unexpected. So we end up asking what people can do and kind of pushing the limits of where people can go and how they can behave in a museum.
But perhaps that's why I don't like saying this is a museum installation, or because the exhibition setting is very distorted for me. It's already setting on a track what may be expectation of touching or touching, doing or doing. And with waiting room, I particularly like that we were in different spaces where it was not clear what your expectations are, where you definitely much more at ease. You had the feeling I'm not supposed to be here, like when you break into a building and go and sneak around. So there was that excitement, but it was more genuine and not like, museums are sort of the churches of our century, where you go, you're deferential, you're trying to understand am I understanding everything? Am I obeying the rules? So I'm happy to shift our work more outside of gallery context.
And it also, I think, even the exhibition context of people don't go in a museum expecting to read rules and have to learn how to play a game, right? That was a huge hurdle too. So the idea of really trying to solve that process, even in Flatlands, we changed it so that it's like the rules are a script. The director picks it up and reads it out loud. So even the process of learning the rules had to become a huge part of the design of the project too. So I think on a lot of levels, it's an interesting but challenging context.
Yeah. still challenging at least the participants and the spaces.
Totally.
There is a question from Emmy, so maybe wait for the mic. I could ask in between, like let's cue Emmy's question. So there's a question about goals and the inspiration of the project. You opened up it a little bit, but how do you set up the goal for a project? Like how does that look like?
I know the answer at the beginning.
Oh, she knows the answer. Okay. I will just sit patiently and listen.
So we're trained to do things work. A game must work, a building must work. And we always are given a specific context, which is amount of people, duration. So I'll give you an example. For Starry Heavens, we knew it was a very large crowd, an opening, an event in which hundreds of people would be there. We had as very first intention to design something that would absorb people, that was not in rounds, so that you didn't have to wait to enter. As soon as a spot is free, you can step in, and it's simple enough that by looking, you're learning. It needed that density to work. We wanted, for example, something that would be a spectacle also for who wasn't participating, because a large amount of people will not be participating. So there are certain conditions which are really like nuts and bolts, which is this going to be in store for a longer period of time, with no attendance, just a moment, that set some very strict design idea. And almost content and storytelling comes later in some way, after those elements are set.
Right. But then I think the more that we worked, we sort of journeyed on the process that we hopefully shared in this talk, which is that we really started thinking about, okay, well, we're managing to sort of solve some of these design problems and make projects for spaces and bring people play and create interesting objects and spaces, but what are we really saying and how are we really interacting with the context, and what does it really mean? And I think that, again, waiting rooms and the last version of 16 tons, we really are shifting our goals, right? Both thinking about environmental sustainability, but also thinking about changing people's relationship to rules and play and the institutions in which we're working. So we're still figuring it out.
Ongoing process. Emmy, go ahead.
Okay, thank you for your talk. It was really nice to hear. I've been doing similar types of projects in my past, and I've noticed that a lot of these games that have something to do in a social context or in a real-life environments have to account for the expectations that the people have when they're entering space. And it's sometimes even a question if they know that they are entering a play space. So especially concerning the Playhouse project, which I would have loved to be there as well, how were the guests primed for the experience? So did they know that they were going to be playing a game when they entered the space, or what did they know about
for
the
waiting
situation?
rooms, you mean?
Yeah.
Waiting rooms, we actually tried to...
We didn't know how to name it. When it was presented by the institution... When
they were advertising it.
It's not theater.
It's not an escape room.
Saying a game would be misleading. That, you have no idea. I don't think we arrived to one word. And
but we decided not to call it a game. And actually, they said it's sort of a topsy-turvy bureaucracy. So they were sort of describing the experience, but it was, we realized that we wanted people to go in without expectations that it was a game, because we didn't want people to think, okay, I'm here to get points and level up. And interestingly, some LARP people did come, very much treated it like a game, but what was nice is that there were other people that were treating it like an exhibition or a performance, and then they were just colliding, like speaking completely different languages and different expectations. So the LARP people were hustling the other people, saying like, oh, I have a nickel. Do you have 5 pennies you can give me for this nickel? Oh, okay, and then they would realize, oh wait, I needed those 5 pennies. Why did I give them away? This person tricked me. So interesting. There were really interesting things like that happened. But we really did. I think that our approach was to not try and prejudge it as a game and sort of let it emerge.
People would have been disappointed because it was, and what you ask is really at the core. We are long discussion with how is this going to present it, to
Right.
be presented.
And I really believe, and I think this is also true for commercial games, right, or any commercial product, or even a building that you enter. You see the title, you see the App Store description. That is your cognitive frame that you step through when you're entering into the actual game, right? So that is the expectation that you build. It's a huge part of the design, because the experience is not in the space. The experience is in the end, inside people's heads and their perceptions and understanding of those perceptions. So I think that, just to say that I think it's a really important question for any project, because thinking about those expectations, cultural expectations and social expectations, they have a huge impact on someone's experience of anything.
And we were paired in the first installation with a psychologist and
Of waiting rooms.
And also those expectation and the experience change so much depending on your body. My parents are older. I'm realizing they're weaker. For anybody who would have harder time standing or not knowing how long is this going to be? Is it 1 minute, 10 minutes? It can become distressing rather than let me figure it out. The uncertainty, so I have no idea what's going to happen next. Can be a completely different experience.
There's a lot of discomfort in waiting rooms.
Even how we will manage and make sure that to let no people follow the rule, but also finding way to communicate. For the fact that we were going in spaces that were usually not accessible meant that sometimes there are limits on accessibility. How do you facilitate accessibility to everybody, even where accessibility isn't quite there? So there's so many layers that has to make the experience as pleasurable and uncomfortable at the same time for everybody in different way. Yeah.
But again, that's sort of also our message in the talk, right? That is design. Thinking about those layers, thinking about those audiences in an expanded way.
We were terrified when the donor benefactor were participating, because I don't want to be ageist. I mean, we knew physically it'd be harder for somebody who was not in their 20, 30 and ready to go up and down stairs over and over and over and over again. And a nice thing is that things balanced out, and we were able to adjust, modify for different needs.
Right, and there is agency in terms of sort of choosing the pace of the experience that you want.
Thank you. We're running out of time, but I still want to ask a question, but unfairly asking you to keep it very short as an answer. Okay. Where do you want to take the play next? Like, what are the spaces that you want to occupy next with play?
I think we're very interested in occupying, we had waiting rooms, for example, in a museum and also in a museum of science and in a museum of art. I think we would love to see it in an actual office building or bank or post office, right? That's sort of our dream, or a library.
A functioning institution.
Yeah. So that then the layers between the fiction and the reality can really blur and get strained.
And the museum is a functioning institution, because we looked at that as a functioning institution, not as the exhibition content.
Right.
But
it is sort of church-like, as you say, as well.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.